Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, July 12th, 2023, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last week. And what we'll do each week is take our questions that we ask here on the Roundup from our newsletter that starts on Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, and that newsletter comes out at that time if you're subscribing through our website, and I'll be dropping the link into the chat here for the places where you can get that to register if you prefer email inbox delivery of the newsletter. That will come Monday mornings, again, 9 a.m. Eastern. The alternative is to if you'd like to see this week's edition of the newsletter, I'll drop the link for that as well in the chat, as well as our second way of receiving the newsletter, and that is via our LinkedIn service. So if you prefer to get your international ed news via LinkedIn, you can do so by going to the link for our LinkedIn subscription page for the newsletter, this week's edition as well. So you can subscribe via that method so that you can see all the news that potentially we cover in question format here on Wednesday afternoons. And the reason for that is we see themes each week that develop from those news stories. We give you our hot takes on those news stories in the newsletter that comes out on Mondays, either via LinkedIn or the website. The other option is from those news stories, we see these themes develop that kind of coalesce around some questions that we think are quite important for our leaders that follow us, SMIE Consulting, in the industry, across international education, not only in the U.S. but around the world. We're grateful for your participation in our chats, on the live chats on Wednesdays. But we also appreciate you subscribing to our newsletter, which now reaches over 1,200 individuals around the world. So thank you very much for making the newsletter part of your international edification each week. So as we do each week, we take the news stories that we see develop in the newsletter, and we look at some themes that we see developing. And today we're going to answer the following 3 questions. Why should we celebrate immigrants and refugees? Where are Chinese students going? And where are your top priorities for recruitment in terms of destination markets in the coming year? So we'll answer those 3 questions and more today. So let's get right into it. First question, why should we celebrate immigrants and refugees in the United States? And yes, if you hadn't guessed, it is a rhetorical question. Of course we should. Our nation is a country of immigrants. We were founded by those who left their home countries to colonize the United States and eventually colonize the Americas here, this part of British North America. That at the time in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, was seen as a refuge away from a new opportunity away from the mother country, but in a new colony. But soon developed those initial feelings of no taxation without representation, and that's led to the American Revolution in 1776 and eventually becoming our own nation after the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and inaugurating our first president, George Washington, in 1789. So there was a long road, and since then, since our country's founding, immigrant communities have been welcomed in varying degrees of friendliness, depending on where they were from, of course, that impacted that originally. But whether from Europe, whether from enslaved peoples that came to the U.S. initially and received freedom afterwards, to Native American populations that were here long before us, that are part of who we are as a nation now. As the country expanded, it's from sea to shining sea. It has been developed in waves by immigrants that built the railroads, the Irish immigrants and Northern European immigrants that built the railroads from the East Coast, the Chinese immigrants that came and settled and helped build the railroads in from the West Coast, and everywhere in between. We've seen these flows of immigrants, immigrant communities in various waves since the earliest days of the country. And myself, I'm an immigrant. I came to the U.S. at age 5, so I had a British accent at the time, but my father's company at the time transferred him to their U.S. headquarters, and I was an L2 intercompany transfer dependent when I came to the United States as an international student in kindergarten. So immigrants and refugees, we've had stories of refugees that have come to the U.S. over the decades, over the centuries, is extensive. We have been seen, and maybe not as much as we used to be, but we had been seen as a shining light, that city on a hill that attracted individuals from all over the world that were trying to escape persecution in their own countries to come to a place where they would be welcomed. Maybe at least not initially, depending on where they were coming from, but in the end became important pieces and foundational pieces of our society, of our communities. No matter where you were from in the world, you could come and you could make it in the U.S. And that was how the Statue of Liberty came to us from the French. Give us your huddled masses, your poor, your huddled masses that came to the U.S. as an escape from the persecution or the economic deprivation they were facing in their home countries. And the past of refugees and immigrants over the years has been spotted one in terms of the way they've been treated in certain periods, and it's never been this completely rosy story for everyone at all. And certain groups have received certain persecution along the way, even legislatively. There were waves of not only immigrants coming to the U.S., but also reactions against that in times when they were seen as, in politicians' eyes, as less than, and they were legislated against groups coming from certain countries. But why do we celebrate them, or should we celebrate them? Because they have gone through so much to get here. And we often, and as American citizens, even though I am one now, I don't take for granted my path to become and the privilege I've experienced to be able to get where I am and the opportunities I have today because of the journey that my parents went through and my rights as a U.S. citizen. I don't take that for granted at all. But certainly as an immigrant, I think that we even see greater value in what the United States can and should represent in the world as a place of a land of opportunity. Where they can come and achieve their own version of the American dream. And that's something that's always been held out and seen as a positive, why people continue to come in record numbers to the United States, flooding our southern borders, people coming for economic migration to trying to escape a persecution from gangs or whatever it might have been in their home countries. So we continue to see these massive flows of immigrants that have come into the United States, some legally, some illegally, but have come here for that reason to become, have their piece of the American dream. For some, it has taken a long, long time to achieve that dream. Some, it's still pending, even though they've been in the country for decades. That's part of the challenge of our immigration system. It's clearly broken. Everyone knows it is. But the political will has never coalesced around this topic to do something about it in a substantial and transformative way that can make the United States, once again, that shining beacon. The stories that I'm going to share this week are from that kind of back up what we're talking about here. Is first a Brookings article called "Why Immigrants Are America's Superpower." And it goes into covering a lot of the details of interviews David Dollar, or the interviewer is David Dollar, host of the Brookings Trade podcast, Dollar and Cents. And he's interviewing in this podcast, basically, Wendy Edelberg, senior fellow at the Brookings and director of the Hamilton Project, talking about the immigrant experience, early immigrants through to today. And it's a really insightful interview. And I think it reflects a lot of what us in international education talk about all the time in terms of the kinds of people who we see wanting to come to the United States to study. They have the same dreams and potential for what they want to do and see as the ability to make the most for their families through their education that they receive here in the U.S. and those that decide that they want to stay and do so legally. Now you see these opportunities really that immigrants and those that come as students that want to become immigrants really have just an incredible benefit to the U.S. in terms of what their contributions have been to the founding of our country, to building our buildings, to populating our states, to paying their taxes, to becoming contributing members to society. All of these things are seen as vastly popular, prominent examples of why immigrants can and should be treated as well as as I would hope, as fellow immigrants would hope. So the second piece, our article that's connected to this, is from the National Foundation for American Policy. For those that have followed Stuart Anderson, this is his organization. He regularly contributes to Forbes and talks about immigration issues, work visa relations, that type of thing. And he has a new policy brief out on AI and immigrants, and has some really fascinating facts in here that 70% of full-time graduate students in fields related to artificial intelligence are international students. 77% of the leading U.S.-based AI companies were founded or co-founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. So there's some really great data in this, and some anecdotal stories of those foreign-born individuals that have come to the United States and are playing now a critical role in development of key skills and technologies in AI. So that's another great reason to celebrate them. A third article dealing specifically with refugees is actually a fairly significant landmark in U.S. migration, immigration, refugee policy, frankly, in terms of access to education. The government has now created this path to U.S. colleges for refugees that allows, it's backed by the U.S. State Department, will enable qualified students to resettle in the United States, enroll at a participating institution, and obtain legal permanent residency with the opportunity to apply for U.S. citizenship. The program is called Welcome Corps on Campus, and that allows American groups, Americans who privately sponsor refugee students, will allow these Americans to privately sponsor refugee students. This can be through groups or foundations, agencies, all of that. And the effort, according to this Chronicle article, it's meant to provide refugees with two things nearly all of them lack: access to post-secondary education and certainty about where they will live in the future. So it is the first of its kind program in the United States that will allow refugee students to enter the U.S. This is those that are looking to come into the United States that aren't already here as refugees. So that it kind of preempts the F1. And it's different from an F1 visa because obviously refugees fall into a different category. It's called a P4 category. Will enable refugees to stay in the country after completing their studies. International students attending colleges on F1 visas don't have federal aid eligibility, and they can only work for a limited duration in their current status, in their student status. So very encouraging to see this happening. Because for those of us who work on campuses who have a heart for refugee communities in their areas, this certainly will provide a cleaner pathway for them, particularly if they're obviously this is a new class of refugees coming in that are outside the country looking to come in for study in addition to their refugee status. It's a P4 category. So that's important for refugees to know that category exists for them if they're at college age and looking to continue their education, that they have that opportunity. So very encouraging to see that. Another reason to celebrate that how the kinds of things we can do for the displaced populations in the world. And there are over, at the end of 2022, according to the Chronicle article, there were over 108 million people worldwide that have been forcibly displaced due to conflict, persecution, violence, human rights violations, or other disruptions. So that's an increase of 19 million over 2021. So that displaced persons includes more than 35 million refugees. And a lot of those in the last year that are not counted in this 2022 number, actually there would be many of these counted in the 2022 number. That largest increase, that 19 million, has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine. So that's certainly significant reason for the number of refugees that are looking to that are displaced, that 108 million. So we're really encouraged by what the future might mean for populations like these refugees. I'm really encouraged to see that our immigrant populations that are so involved in our tech communities are being recognized for their roles in new tech development like AI. And really glad to see that there are foundations out there that are backing pro-immigration policies and supporting what are our traditional roots as a country. We are a country of immigrants. Many of my colleagues who work in the profession have either come as international students themselves, or have become citizens eventually, or have our first generation immigrants themselves. That they play a role in keeping that torch lit for our immigrant populations. That yes, around the world you can still come and you can make a difference. Whether you're an asylee, you're a refugee, you're an immigrant, you're an international student, the opportunities are here for you, and we have to represent. And we have to always advocate for the possibilities for students and those that wish to pursue education, whether as refugees, as international students, as immigrants. They have that access to those opportunities. So really excited to see that commitment coming from the government to allow this Welcome Corps on campus, and developing some other programs that will protect these folks in the most folks that are most susceptible to being taken advantage of. They really need the support. They're really in trouble and need that kind of support that only our government and our institutions can give. So really encouraged to see that, and hopefully those trends continue as we look to the future. Now, next question of the day is, where are all the Chinese students going? And this is a question we ask fairly regularly on the Roundup. Not just Chinese students, but every student, because it's always a moving target. 25 years ago, China was only sending graduate students abroad that we would receive in the United States. It wasn't even close. I remember in 2003 when I started working at another institution on 1-2-1 programs with dual degrees with partner institutions in China, to have undergraduates come do their first year in China, come for their second and third year in the U.S., go back for their fourth year, and then receive 2 degrees, one from the Chinese university, one from the U.S. institution. And at that time, in the early 90s, undergraduate Chinese students were a rarity in the U.S. They soon became, by the mid-teens, they became the largest percentage of Chinese students were undergraduate as opposed to graduate that were in the United States. So it was within 10 years, it was a complete sea change in terms of the dynamic of the Chinese students that were coming to the U.S. Since COVID, actually since the middle of 2015, 2016, we started to see a drop-off in the numbers of undergraduate Chinese coming, and that has contributed over time, plus the pandemic, to dramatic decrease in the number of Chinese students studying in the United States, by a drop-off of well over 100,000 in the course of the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years. So coming out of the pandemic, a lot of universities were hoping for a rebound in their Chinese numbers. Some are seeing it, some are not. Some who have been engaged in China for quite a while and had infrastructure, had a ground game in the country, probably are able to respond quicker coming out of the pandemic than those that weren't. But overall, the number of Chinese students going abroad is about the same, but lower, not just to the United States, but elsewhere. But what has happened, and certainly in the last 10 years, 8 years at least, you've seen the variety of destinations for Chinese students growing considerably. We've seen in the past, during the pandemic especially, Chinese master's degree students flooded into England and were enhancing their status as the number one country of origin for international students in the UK. That's starting to slide off a bit too. Their undergraduate numbers also started to slide. You've seen Australia come out of the pandemic rebounding well, but not as well as they thought with China. New Zealand also similarly hasn't been as open of dialogue as maybe they had 10 years ago. with China in terms of student flows. So we're seeing some slow recoveries in certain markets. Canada has grown their Chinese populations, but still India is their number one. So there are other destinations where they're going, and where are they going if it's not into the major Western nations for English language training and degree studies? And the article that we're sharing now is from an ICEF Monitor piece on Chinese students are turning to Asian destinations in greater numbers. Though the article does make clear the UK and the US and UK are still the top two destinations for Chinese students, that a number of Southeast Asian and East Asian nations are becoming major destinations. For Korea, for example, is the number one. Chinese students are their number one population for students studying in Korea. Hong Kong, likewise, their number one source of international students are mainland Chinese students. That you see some of the numbers that are coming up for that Chinese high school students are starting to look abroad as well for high school education, finishing their high school abroad, as well as other K through 12 options. So we are seeing a variety of places where Chinese students are going. The weaker Chinese economy maybe is also coming out of the pandemic. They're still recovering. We saw a lot of signs of that when I was in China a couple weeks ago. You see that economies there have not recovered as quickly as they might have. So the spending power of those that might have previously been able to afford a Western education coming out of the pandemic, with families were financially impacted by that. By the restrictions of travel and economies within the country, that has led some families that might have previously been able to afford a Western education start looking more regionally. And there are attractive destinations outside of Korea, outside of Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Thailand are all becoming more popular for Chinese students. So they're diffusing around many more countries, but there's a larger group that are staying closer to home. So we're seeing that. That there's some recent student, New Oriental, one of the larger educational agencies in China, did a survey from December 22 to February 23, had almost 10,000 respondents, 78% students, 22% parents. That did share that the U.S. still is the top destination by about 3% over the U.K. Followed next by Canada, Hong Kong in fourth place. Japan, Hong Kong, Japan are tied at 15%, Singapore at 14%, Australia at 14%, Germany at 7%, New Zealand at 7%, France at 7%. So you see the range of countries where Chinese students are going is considering to change. At one point in 2019, the U.S. was top with 45%, and that's dropped off to 34%. So an 11% drop in just the last 4 years. So the percentage of where the increases have come, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore are the biggest increases in attracting Chinese students. So for graduate studies, as I mentioned, U.S. had at one point 150,000 plus Chinese graduate students studying in the U.S. Those numbers are down considerably. The U.K. has jumped to the top spot for Chinese graduate or postgraduate students, but U.S. remains firmly in number 2 for that area. So we are seeing some change, as I said, in terms of where students go, and that ties into what we talk about with 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management. That first P, perspective, having that global perspective and knowing that the students that you're after in China are also not only applying now to the West, they're also applying to Hong Kong, to Japan, to Singapore, other Asian destinations. So there are more cooks in the kitchen trying to get the same students you are. So how you respond to that and show awareness of that in your messaging to these students, and talks about the advantages of the U.S., the quality, the post-study work opportunities, the campus experience that doesn't exist elsewhere. All of that should be the selling points that you talk about, not just your individual institutional selling points, but highlight those as a destination country as well, because you have to convince them to come to your country, not just your institution. So oftentimes there can be push and pull factors there. Put some things that might be pushing them away in our policy department, but other things in terms of the quality of life that they can experience on campus, opportunities for jobs after graduation, all that needs to be communicated through your messaging. That's how you keep a hold of market share and don't lose anything further. So Chinese students do have many more options, and the quicker we realize this as U.S. institutions, the better prepared we are to respond to the kinds of concerns that they might have. Some may still have the safety issues. Some may have the Asian hate issues that they might have heard stories of and maybe have examples of. You will have to have ways to counter that, and the best way to do that is with your current students that are living that positive experience, that can share what's happening right now on your campus, that aren't just relying on what you say as an admissions officer. There's authority sometimes in what we say in terms of process, in terms of scholarships, in terms of value and that type of thing. But when it comes to that student piece, as much as we say we take care of our students well, it's when our students can say that for themselves that really the benefits of what we do are really shown through and will hit home with intended prospective students and their families. So we talked about one of the markets that they are going to, China. Chinese students are going to Hong Kong, to the SAR. And one of Hong Kong's kind of during the pandemic, the brakes were put on expanding their quotas on international students to limit them during the pandemic. But now those caps are being changed, and that they're going to allow for 24-25 a doubling of the cap on international student commencements. So where are their enrollments coming from? Primarily from China. But they're also looking beyond China. They're looking at Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and some other key Southeast Asian markets. So there are 8 universities improved by about 100 students between 2019, 20, and 21, 22. 65% of those international students were coming from mainland China. That's right at the end of the pandemic. So there are 8 institutions in Hong Kong that were limited to a hard cap of about 20% of their students could be local, that were sponsored by, fell under the University Grants Committee in Hong Kong. So that cap on domestic students now is, in terms of spaces that they have, now 80% can come from elsewhere. So that they can admit, so there are some changes coming up, and there's another ISEF article that I'll drop the link to as well into the chat that talks through the specifics of the Hong Kong challenges in terms of where their students are coming from. I do want to finish quickly with a student survey shift, and this is answering the question, where are your recruitment priorities this year? Obviously, everybody's got their own answers to that, but in terms of what other universities are saying, we saw recently the IIE Spring Snapshot Survey of 527 institutions collected between April and May, indicated that U.S. educators know that they have to reach out not only to international students abroad, but also to ones domestically. So they have an interesting chart of where the top priority countries are domestically for undergraduate, top priorities for international students for undergraduate studies and then for graduate studies. So interestingly, and this is the first time I've seen this for both undergrad and grad broken out this way. India now tops the list for both undergraduate recruitment at 57% and graduate recruitment at 77%. You have the U.S. colleges that responded are targeting India first. For undergraduates, the next largest market are U.S. international students studying at the high school level. So really good to see that going after low-hanging fruit in the U.S. already, training domestic staffs on how to recruit international students. For after those students, 57% India, 55% U.S. international students in high school here, 48% with Vietnam, then 41% South Korea, 40% Brazil, then China at 39%. And then other U.S. International students studying at the undergraduate level already. Canada, Japan, Nigeria rounded out the top 10. Now, in terms of areas where they're being targeted. At the grad level, India is running away with it, 77%, number one. China, number two at 42%. Then U.S. international students studying at the undergraduate level. So good to see that. Nigeria and Vietnam were the other countries in the top 5 that were targeted. Then South Korea, Brazil, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Canada. So interesting details in that article. So I wanted to share those with you so that you have that in case you're looking for other evidence to show why you should be recruiting in certain destinations, destination markets. That hopefully will help. The last thing I'll leave you with is a pat on the back to my good friend Tara Braun, who had been at Calvin University, has finally, after extensive vacation in the British Isles and Ireland, has now settled in her new role at Ferris State as the Director of International Education. So congratulations to Tara, and if you see her around at an upcoming conference, she's at Ferris State now, not Calvin University. So congrats to Tara, and we look forward to seeing her and all of you at upcoming events, and hopefully for those that are traveling to India for the IC3 conference, I'll be making my first trip to Hyderabad for this event. Looking forward to meeting with the IC3 community and movement and my fellow U.S. colleagues as we kick off the fall recruitment in style in Hyderabad this August. So until next week, we look forward to chatting with you again. But until then, have a wonderful day. Cheers.